They will tell you that power is earned through virtue and love through honesty. They are not wrong, but they are incomplete. There exists another current beneath the visible world, silent, ancient, and ruthlessly effective. This is not a book about becoming good. It is a book about becoming unforgettable. Not about attraction in the conventional sense, about the management of beauty, the performance of charm, the optimization of a dating profile. It is about something older and stranger, the capacity to become for another person a presence so vivid and so precisely calibrated to their inner world that ordinary life, without you in it, begins to feel insufficient. This knowledge has existed in one form or another for as long as human beings have been trying to understand each other. It appears in the seduction manuals of ancient India, in the political philosophy of Machiavelli, in the behavioral research of 20th century psychology laboratories, in the memoirs of lovers who could not explain their own power and did not try. It has never been fully codified in a single place, because those who possess it have generally understood that its value depends on most people not having access to it. What follows is an attempt to codify it honestly, not to provide a manual for exploitation, but to illuminate a territory that exists, whether or not we choose to look at it. The person who understands this territory can navigate it with intention. The person who does not will navigate it by accident, either as a practitioner who does not fully understand what they are doing, or as a target who does not know what is being done to them. Enter only if you dare to understand what most people spend their entire lives either wielding unconsciously or succumbing to without ever knowing why. Chapter 1. The Gravity of the Forbidden. There is a particular kind of hunger that visits only the places we are told we cannot enter. It does not announce itself with logic. It arrives as a pulling sensation in the chest, a heightened alertness in the eyes, a warmth that spreads without permission. Humans have known this hunger since the very beginning of recorded time. And perhaps the earliest, most honest account of it is not found in a psychology textbook, but in the oldest religious text on earth. The story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden is not simply a theological parable about sin. It is one of the most precise psychological portraits of forbidden desire ever written. In that garden, two people had access to everything: abundance without limit, beauty without decay, companionship without distance. Yet the one thing they could not have became the only thing that mattered. The forbidden fruit did not grow sweeter because it was nutritious. It grew sweeter because a boundary existed around it. This is the foundational truth of the forbidden. Restriction does not diminish desire, it ignites it. The psychology behind the pull. In 1981, psychologists Sharon Brame and Jack Brame formalized what humans had always known instinctively. They called it reactance theory, the documented observation that when a person's freedom to have or do something is reduced or threatened, they experience a motivational state that drives them to restore that freedom. In plain terms, tell someone they cannot have something and watch how much they want it. This is not a flaw in human psychology, it is a feature. Throughout evolutionary history, the things that were guarded, hidden, or inaccessible tended to be the most valuable. A fruit behind a thorn bush, a stream past dangerous territory, a person surrounded by rivals, all represented resources worth fighting for. The brain learned to interpret scarcity as a signal of value, and prohibition as a signal of scarcity. The dark seducer understands this mechanism, not as a theory but as a tool. The first move in the game of forbidden attraction is not to pursue. It is to suggest that pursuit may not be entirely welcome, to be just difficult enough that desire has room to grow, to occupy that magnetic space between available and untouchable. History speaks, the most dangerous love affairs. History is flooded with examples of how the forbidden intensifies rather than diminishes passion. Perhaps no love story illustrates this more tragically than that of Heloise and Abelard in 12th century France. Peter Abelard was the most celebrated philosopher and theologian in Paris, a man of towering intellect and dangerous charisma. Heloise d'Argenteuil was his student, brilliant beyond the standards of any era. Their relationship was forbidden by every measure, by his position as her tutor, by the church, by her guardian uncle. They pursued it anyway. Their letters, which survive to this day, are among the most raw and honest documents of human longing ever preserved. What is remarkable is not that they fell in love. It is that the specific shape of their love, urgent, secretive, electric with danger, was inseparable from its forbidden nature. When Abelard was castrated by hired men working for Heloise's uncle, and both were forced into religious orders, Heloise continued writing letters to him for decades. Not soft letters, letters burning with a hunger that monastic life had not extinguished. The wall had not killed the desire. It had preserved it in amber. Across the Atlantic and across the centuries, we find another kind of forbidden passion, this one political rather than romantic. During the American Prohibition era of the 1920s, the United States government banned the production and sale of alcohol. The result was not sobriety. The result was the golden age of the speakeasy, secret bars behind false walls and unmarked doors where drinking became not a casual habit, but an act of thrilling transgression. Alcohol tasted better behind a locked door. It always does. The mechanics of forbidden attraction in practice. The seducer who grasps the gravity of the forbidden does not simply withhold themselves. They create a carefully structured atmosphere in which the other person feels that access to them is something to be earned rather than assumed. They signal interest clearly enough that the target feels seen, but they never fully confirm that the path is open. There is always a door that seems unlocked, but has never been explicitly opened. This might look like a conversation that reveals genuine depth and then stops before completion. It might look like a physical presence that approaches warmth and then retreats just before contact. It might look like a person who makes eye contact, that holds half a second longer than comfort allows and then looks away first, leaving the other person wondering what just happened and why they cannot stop thinking about it. The key principle is asymmetry. The target should always feel that they know slightly less than they need to know, want slightly more than they have been given. Every interaction should end with a small open question that the target carries home with them: the role of danger in desire. In 1974, psychologists Donald Dutton and Arthur Aron conducted one of the most replicated experiments in the history of social psychology. They had an attractive woman approach men on two different bridges. One a stable, low wooden bridge, the other a narrow, swaying suspension bridge, 230 feet above a rocky canyon. On the scary bridge, men were far more likely to call the woman afterward, and their stories contained far more romantic and sexual imagery. The researchers concluded that the physiological arousal from fear had been misattributed as attraction. What this tells us is biologically significant. The body does not have a separate switch for fear and desire. Both activate the same systems: elevated heart rate, heightened alertness, increased sensitivity to the environment. A person who encounters you in a context of mild tension or uncertainty will experience you through a more aroused nervous system. You become, quite literally, more vivid to them. The dark seducer uses this knowledge not to terrify, but to create an atmosphere of elegant tension. There is always something slightly unresolved in their presence, something that keeps the nervous system from completely relaxing. And the target, unable to fully explain why, finds themselves thinking about this person long after the encounter has ended. The warning within the lesson: there is something important to understand about the gravity of the forbidden before we proceed. It operates on both sides. The seducer who positions themselves as a forbidden object also begins to experience a particular intoxication. The power of being wanted, the gratification of being pursued. This can become its own addiction. The moment you begin deliberately constructing your inaccessibility, you must remain conscious of the fact that you are playing with a force that does not distinguish between its target and its wielder. The earliest Greek myth of Narcissus is instructive here. Narcissus was so consumed by his own reflection, by the image of something he could not actually possess, that he wasted away beside the pool. The lesson is not simply about vanity. It is about what happens when the structure of the forbidden is turned inward, when the seducer becomes seduced by their own power. The forbidden is a current that moves in every direction. Handle it with precision, or it will handle you. Chapter 2. The Beautiful Lie, Constructing a Self They Cannot Resist. In the winter of 1888, a short, stocky man with a thick mustache arrived in Arles, France to paint. He had spent years in the salons of Paris reinventing himself, transforming from a failed preacher and art dealer's assistant into one of the most discussed figures in the French avant-garde. His name was Vincent van Gogh, and while his story is most often told as a tragedy of mental illness, there is another layer worth examining: his extraordinary, deliberate effort to construct an artistic identity that matched the vision he had of himself, not the reality others assigned him. Van Gogh's letters to his brother Theo, hundreds of them, reveal a man consciously crafting a persona. He wrote about what kind of artist he intended to be before he had the skill to be it. He dressed the part, spoke the part, associated with the people who inhabited the world he was building toward. He was not lying, exactly. He was doing something more sophisticated than lying. He was constructing a self that did not yet fully exist and inhabiting it until reality caught up. This is the essence of what we will examine in this chapter: the art of becoming exactly what another person most needs to find in the world. The persona as architecture. The word person comes from the Latin persona, the mask worn by Roman actors in the theater. In ancient Roman drama, the masks were not deception, they were function. Each mask communicated a character type instantly to the audience, allowing the emotional arc of the play to proceed without confusion. The mask was not less real than the face beneath it. In many ways, it was more real, more deliberate, more precisely communicative, more fully inhabited. Every human being wears a persona in social situations. The question is not whether you are wearing one, but whether you are wearing it consciously or by accident. The person who has never examined their social mask is at the mercy of a costume assembled from childhood wounds, social approval, and unconscious imitation. The dark seducer, by contrast, chooses their costume with the precision of a theater director. This begins with a fundamental skill that most people never develop: the ability to listen not to what people say, but to what they are hungry for. Reading hunger. In the early 20th century, a man named Dale Carnegie built an empire on a simple observation: people are far more interested in themselves than in anything else in the world. His 1936 book, How to Win Friends and Influence People, became one of the best-selling books in history, not because it revealed dark secrets, but because it named something universally true. The fastest path to becoming indispensable to another person is to become the person who most fully sees them. But Carnegie's approach was genuinely warm and other-focused. What we are examining here goes a step further and into darker territory. The skilled persona constructor does not simply listen to feel connected. They listen to gather intelligence. Every conversation is a map of the other person's interior landscape, their fears, their unmet needs, their private fantasies about who they could be and what they deserve. The art is subtle. You do not ask direct questions. You create conditions in which the other person's hungers reveal themselves naturally. You pay attention to where their voice softens, where it hardens. What topics cause their eyes to become slightly unfocused? The sign of a person touching a memory rather than living in the present moment. What they say they want and what their body says they need. These are almost never the same thing. Historical maestros of the constructed self. Giacomo Casanova, the 18th century Venetian adventurer, is remembered primarily as a seducer. But his memoirs, 12 volumes written in his 70s with remarkable candor, reveal that what made him irresistible was not his appearance or his wealth, both of which were unremarkable. What made him irresistible was his extraordinary ability to become, for each woman he encountered, precisely the figure she had been waiting for. With a lonely aristocrat, he became a devoted intellectual companion. With a young girl from a convent who had never experienced the world, he became a patient, gentle initiator. With a woman trapped in a loveless marriage, he became the proof that she was still desirable, still vital, still worth choosing. He read each person with the accuracy of a diagnostician and constructed his response accordingly. He did not lie about who he was. He emphasized different facets of himself, genuinely existing facets that resonated most precisely with the need in front of him. This is a critical distinction. The most effective persona is not fabricated from nothing. It is selected from the real material of who you are. Everyone contains multitudes. The construction is not invention, it is curation, the mirror technique. Psychologists have documented what they call the chameleon effect, the unconscious tendency of people to mimic the posture, mannerisms, and speech patterns of those they are interacting with. Tanya Chartrand and John Barg's 1999 research demonstrated that when someone subtly mirrors another person's body language, the mirrored person likes them more, feels more comfortable, and reports the interaction as smoother and more satisfying, without knowing why. The dark seducer uses this not unconsciously but deliberately, and they extend it beyond body language into the realm of worldview and identity. By reflecting back to a person their own values, their own aesthetic preferences, their own way of seeing the world, but doing so with slightly more intensity and clarity than the person themselves can manage, the seducer creates a remarkable experience. The target feels more like themselves in the seducer's presence than they do anywhere else. This is extraordinarily seductive. Most people move through life feeling only partially understood. To encounter someone who seems to see you completely, who laughs at exactly the right moments, who finishes your thoughts, who holds the same peculiar opinions you have always been slightly embarrassed about, is to feel for perhaps the first time genuinely found. The cost of the mask. There is a story from ancient Greece about the sculptor Pygmalion, who carved a woman so perfect from ivory that he fell in love with his own creation. He dressed the statue, brought it gifts, lay beside it at night. The goddess Aphrodite, moved by his devotion, breathed life into the statue, and Pygmalion's creation became real. The myth is often read as a romance, but it is also a warning. Pygmalion had constructed something so precisely fitted to his own ideals that when it became animate, it had no interiority of its own. It was a mirror with a heartbeat. The seducer who wears the constructed persona for long enough faces the same crisis. The mask becomes comfortable. The genuine self, which was always present beneath it, grows quieter and quieter until it becomes difficult to hear. The seducer becomes extraordinarily skilled at becoming what others need, and increasingly uncertain about what they themselves want, who they themselves are, when no one is watching and there is no need to perform. Understand this not as a reason to avoid the skill, but as a reason to practice it with consciousness. The persona is a tool. A hammer used without awareness will eventually strike the hand that holds it. Know when you are wearing the mask, and know, at least sometimes, what your face looks like beneath it. Chapter 3. Velvet over Venom. Seduction as Invisible War. In the spring of 1519, a small fleet of Spanish ships arrived on the eastern coast of what is now Mexico. Their commander, Hernán Cortés, faced a seemingly impossible task: conquer an empire of millions with fewer than 600 soldiers. What followed became one of the most studied military campaigns in history. He studied the political fault lines within the Aztec Empire, the subject peoples who resented Tenochtitlan's dominance, the rival lords who had grievances. He positioned himself and his men as liberators, as allies, as powerful friends rather than conquerors. He offered alliances, gifted carefully selected presents, attended ceremonies with respect, and allowed his hosts to believe that they were in control of the relationship, right until the moment they were not. By the time the Aztec Emperor Moctezuma too understood what was happening, Cortés had already woven a web of alliance, dependency, and psychological leverage so complex that it was nearly impossible to cut free from without tearing apart the entire political structure of the empire. The conquest of the Aztec Empire was, before it was a military campaign, an act of psychological warfare wrapped in courtesy, patience, and apparent goodwill. This is what we mean by velvet over venom, the architecture of invisible war. True seduction, in its most powerful form, is never experienced as aggression by its target. It is experienced as connection, as understanding, as the rare and wonderful feeling of being genuinely valued. The target does not feel conquered, they feel chosen. This distinction is the entire art. Sun Tzu, writing in China approximately 25 centuries ago in The Art of War, articulated the principle this way: the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. He was speaking of military strategy, but the principle extends perfectly to the domain of influence. The seducer who must use force has already failed. Force reveals the mechanism. It makes the game visible, and a visible game is a game that can be refused. The invisible war operates through 4 primary channels: framing, pacing, mirroring, and emotional investment. Each deserves careful examination. Framing. Who controls the story controls the outcome. Every interaction takes place within a frame, a set of unstated assumptions that determine what the interaction means. The person who establishes the frame controls the emotional reality of the encounter, without anyone noticing that control has been exercised. Consider the difference between approaching someone and saying, "I find you interesting. Would you like to have coffee?" versus approaching someone and saying, "You seem like someone who appreciates good conversation. I know a place that takes it seriously." The first sentence frames the invitation as a personal request. The second frames it as recognition of quality, as an invitation extended to someone worthy of a particular experience. The second frame is more seductive, not because it contains more flattery, but because it positions the target as a discerning person who would naturally appreciate what is being offered. The master of framing never argues about facts. They establish a story in which the facts already favor the conclusion they intend. They plant assumptions so gracefully that the target adopts them as their own perceptions. Pacing. The rhythm of advance and retreat. Napoleon Bonaparte, despite his reputation as a figure of overwhelming aggression, was a sophisticated student of timing. His military genius lay partly in his understanding of when not to attack, how to draw the enemy forward, to create a sense of momentum, to let them believe they were winning until the moment the trap closed. He paced his campaigns the way a conductor paces a symphony, building tension through restraint before the decisive crescendo. The seducer uses the same principle. The rhythm of advance and retreat. Warmth followed by slight coolness. Engagement followed by brief distance. Creates a state of productive uncertainty in the target. They are never quite sure where they stand. And a person who is uncertain of where they stand will spend an enormous amount of mental energy trying to resolve that uncertainty. This mental energy directed at you is the beginning of obsession. The target thinks about you, not because you are perfect, but because you are unresolved. You are a question their mind cannot stop trying to answer. Mirroring. The art of elegant agreement. During the Cold War, Soviet intelligence services trained their operatives in a technique they called active measures, a broad strategy of influence that included the careful construction of relationships based on apparent shared values and interests. KGB's operatives assigned to cultivate Western contacts were instructed above all to listen, to validate, to express agreement at key emotional moments. The goal was not to change the target's mind, but to make the target feel profoundly understood, and therefore safe, and therefore willing to share. This technique works because agreement is neurologically pleasurable. When someone confirms our worldview, our brain releases a small hit of dopamine. We like the person who agrees with us. We trust them, we want more of them. The seducer who masters the art of elegant agreement, who learns to validate not randomly, but at precisely the moments when the target most needs validation, becomes associated in the target's nervous system with safety and pleasure simultaneously. Safety and pleasure together are an almost irresistible combination. It is the combination most people spend their entire lives searching for and rarely find. Emotional investment, making them the author of their own captivity. In the 1970s, sociologist Robert Cialdini began his now famous research into the principles of influence. One of his central findings, later published in the landmark 1984 book Influence, was the principle of commitment and consistency. Once a person has taken even a small action that indicates their investment in a relationship or idea, they are psychologically motivated to behave consistently with that action. They have told a story about themselves through their behavior, and they will not easily contradict that story. The dark seducer uses this principle to create a situation where the target makes a series of small, voluntary choices, each one reasonable on its own, that add up to a position from which retreat is psychologically costly. They initiated the last conversation. They suggested the meeting place. They said the words first. Each act of initiative has made them more invested. An investment creates attachment. The velvet is the warmth, the apparent reciprocity, the genuine pleasure of the connection. The venom is the understanding that every moment of warmth is also a carefully placed brick in a structure. The target believes they are building freely, not one that is being built around them. The ethics of the invisible war. Cortés won his war. He also destroyed an entire civilization and introduced centuries of brutal colonial exploitation. The tools he used: psychological manipulation, strategic alliance, the appearance of goodwill masking aggressive intent, were devastatingly effective and left a wound in human history that is not fully healed 5 centuries later. This is offered not as a moral condemnation of influence itself, but as an honest accounting of what these tools can do when wielded without conscience. The invisible war is real. The techniques described in this chapter work. The question of when and why and on whom you choose to use them belongs entirely to your own judgment and your own willingness to live with the consequences of what you construct. Chapter 4. Reading the Wound. How Desire Leaves a Map. In 1895, a Viennese physician named Sigmund Freud began publishing his observations about a remarkable phenomenon he had noticed in his clinical practice. His patients came to him with physical symptoms: paralysis, blindness, chronic pain for which no anatomical cause could be found. Yet these symptoms were real. They experienced them. They suffered from them. What was causing the body to produce genuine suffering without a physical origin? Freud's answer, developed over decades of clinical work and theoretical refinement, was that the human mind conceals from itself the experiences it cannot bear to consciously hold. Trauma, desire, shame, grief, these do not disappear when they become too painful to acknowledge. They go underground. They take up residence in the body, in behavior patterns, in the emotional landscape through which a person navigates their entire life. They become the invisible architecture of who we are. Whether or not you accept every particular of Freudian theory, and many of his specific claims have been substantially revised or abandoned by subsequent research, the central observation holds and has been confirmed by over a century of psychological study. What people hide is often far more revealing than what they show, and the hidden material is precisely what drives the most powerful desires. The map that nobody draws consciously. Every person carries what we might call a desire map, a complex, mostly unconscious geography of what they long for, what they fear, what they feel they deserve, and what they believe is beyond their reach. This map was not chosen. It was drawn by experience, by the quality of early attachment to caregivers, by moments of triumph and humiliation, by the 1,000 small lessons that life teaches about what kind of person you are and what kind of life is available to you. The map is not visible on the surface. In fact, most people have constructed elaborate social performances specifically designed to keep others from reading it, because the map contains material they themselves find uncomfortable, the loneliness they will not name, the ambition they have been taught to call arrogant, the desire for surrender that conflicts with their self-image as someone strong and independent, the need to be chosen that feels too vulnerable to admit. Reading another person's desire map is the foundational skill of the dark seducer. It requires a particular kind of attention, not the performative attentiveness of someone who is simply waiting for their turn to speak, but a deep, patient, almost clinical receptivity to signal what the body says. In the 1960s and 70s, psychologist Paul Ekman conducted research that would eventually reshape our understanding of human emotional expression, working with photographs of facial expressions from cultures around the world, including isolated indigenous cultures that had had no contact with Western media. Ekman demonstrated that certain emotional expressions are universal. The micro-expressions of fear, contempt, sadness, surprise, anger, disgust, and happiness appear on human faces across every culture and cannot be fully suppressed, even by trained performers. These micro-expressions last between 1/25th and 1/5 of a second. They are visible to the trained observer. They leak truth in moments when the social mask is momentarily displaced. When a person says something they do not fully believe, or hears something that touches a nerve they were not expecting to be touched, the seducer who develops sensitivity to these signals gains access to a channel of communication that the target cannot consciously control. They learn to notice the almost imperceptible tension around the eyes when a topic is mentioned that carries significance. The slight shift in breathing, the way a hand moves to cover the throat, a classic self-soothing gesture that indicates discomfort, the genuine smile which involves the muscles around the eyes versus the social smile which does not. Historical readers of human nature. Cardinal Richelieu, chief minister to King Louis XIII of France in the 17th century, was considered by contemporaries to be the most dangerous man in Europe. He commanded no great army himself. He was not physically imposing. His power derived almost entirely from his extraordinary ability to read the desires, fears, and vulnerabilities of the people around him, and to position himself as the essential figure in relation to all of them. Richelieu maintained an extensive network of informants, not simply to gather military intelligence, but to understand the emotional states of the powerful. He knew which nobles were in debt and needed favor. He knew which ones harbored ambitions they had not yet voiced. He knew which ones were frightened of the king's displeasure, and which were confident enough to be dangerous. He read the court the way a physician reads a patient, systematically, patiently, looking for the symptom that reveals the deeper condition. Alexandre Dumas immortalized Richelieu as a villain in The Three Musketeers, but historians who have studied the actual cardinal find a figure of remarkable psychological sophistication, a man who understood that real power is constructed not from force, but from superior knowledge of what other people need and fear. The 7 wounds most people carry. While every person's desire map is unique, patterns emerge across thousands of years of human storytelling, clinical observation, and social research. There are certain wounds that appear with remarkable regularity, certain needs that the majority of people carry in some form at some depth. The wound of invisibility, the deep, often unconscious belief that one is not truly seen or known by others, that the real self remains always somewhat hidden, and therefore always somewhat alone. The wound of inadequacy, the persistent quiet suspicion that one is not quite enough, not smart enough, not attractive enough, not worthy of the very things one most wants. The wound of abandonment, the expectation built from early experiences of loss that people who matter will eventually leave. The wound of powerlessness, the sense that one's choices do not ultimately control one's life, that outcomes happen to rather than because of you. There are others, the wound of shame, the wound of betrayal, the wound of engulfment. But these 4 appear most reliably, most powerfully, in the emotional subtext of adult relationships. The seducer who identifies which wound is most active in a particular person has identified the precise location of their deepest need, and therefore the precise point at which genuine resonance is possible. Reading without exploiting, the choice point. Here we arrive at a junction that this book will revisit many times, because it is the central ethical tension of everything we are discussing. The ability to read a person's wound is, in itself, morally neutral. Every skilled therapist, every great novelist, every deeply loving partner develops some version of this ability. It is the capacity for genuine empathy, the ability to feel into another person's experience rather than simply observing it from the outside. What distinguishes the dark seducer from the therapist or the loving partner is not the ability itself, but the intention behind its use. The therapist reads the wound in order to help heal it. The loving partner reads it in order to move more carefully, to offer what is truly needed rather than what is merely wanted. The dark seducer reads it in order to place themselves at exactly the point of greatest need, not to fill that need genuinely, but to create the impression that only they can fill it. The map is the same. The destination differed, and the person being read cannot always tell, in the early stages, which kind of traveler they are dealing with. This is why self-knowledge is the only reliable protection against being read in this way. A person who knows their own wounds, who has looked at them clearly and with compassion, who has ceased to be ashamed of them, that person cannot easily be navigated by their own need. Their map is not a secret that can be stolen. It is a territory they themselves have learned to walk. Chapter 5. The Hunger Architecture. Engineering Emotional Addiction. In 1948, a behavioral psychologist named B.F. Skinner placed a rat in a box. The box contained a lever. When the rat pressed the lever, it received a food pellet. This was straightforward. The rat learned quickly, pressed the lever regularly, and ate. Skinner then modified the experiment. Instead of delivering a pellet every time the lever was pressed, he programmed the box to deliver pellets at random intervals, sometimes after one press, sometimes after 20, sometimes after 50, never according to a pattern the rat could detect or predict. The results were dramatic. The rat pressed the lever obsessively. It pressed it far more frequently than the rat in the predictable box. It pressed it even during periods when no pellets appeared at all, as if convinced that the next press might be the one. Skinner called this intermittent reinforcement, and it produced what he described as the most resistant to extinction behavior pattern he had ever observed. When he finally stopped delivering pellets altogether, the rat continued pressing the lever for an extraordinarily long time before giving up. Skinner was studying rats, but what he had discovered was the neurological foundation of every human addiction, every compulsive relationship, every love affair from which rational people cannot walk away, even when they can clearly see the harm it is causing them. The neuroscience of wanting. Decades after Skinner, neuroscientist Kent Berridge at the University of Michigan made a discovery that refined our understanding significantly. Using careful experiments with rats, Berridge found that the brain's dopamine system, the system activated by reward, was not actually the system of pleasure. It was the system of wanting. Dopamine does not make us feel good when we receive something. It makes us feel urgent, driven, intensely focused on obtaining something. The implications are profound. What intermittent reinforcement produces is not happiness. It produces a state of heightened, almost painful wanting, a condition in which the mind becomes fixated on the source of the unpredictable reward and cannot easily redirect its attention elsewhere. The person in the grip of an intermittently reinforcing relationship does not feel content. They feel restless, preoccupied, unable to stop thinking about the person who is sometimes warm and sometimes cold, sometimes available and sometimes gone. This is obsession, and it is, as Skinner's rats demonstrate, not a sign of weakness or irrationality in the person experiencing it. It is the entirely predictable result of a specific pattern of reward. Cleopatra in the Architecture of Longing. Cleopatra VII, Queen of Egypt, is remembered as one of the most seductive figures in recorded history, but the ancient accounts that survive, particularly Plutarch's description of her effect on Mark Antony, suggest that her power was not primarily sexual. It was architectural. She constructed an experience of herself that was designed to be impossible to complete. When Antony summoned her to Tarsus in 41 BCE to answer questions about her political loyalties, she did not come immediately. She made him wait. When she arrived, she came not as a suppliant, but as a goddess. Her barge perfumed with incense, her sails of purple silk, herself reclining under a canopy of cloth of gold, attended by boys dressed as cupids fanning her. The arrival was not an answer to his summons. It was a redefinition of the entire relationship. She was not coming to him. He was being granted an audience. Plutarch writes that Mark Antony left sitting alone at the banquet he had prepared to receive her, because everyone in the city had gone to see her arrival, understood at that moment that he had met his match. He was not charmed in the conventional sense. He was destabilized. And destabilization, as we have seen, is the beginning of obsession. In the years that followed, Cleopatra managed the relationship with what modern psychologists would recognize as masterful intermittent reinforcement. Periods of extraordinary intimacy alternated with her political demands, her own crises, her capacity for cold practicality. Antony could never quite settle into the comfort of certainty with her. She remained throughout their relationship slightly beyond the horizon of full possession. The 5 strings of emotional addiction. Building on what we understand from behavioral psychology and historical observation, we can identify 5 specific elements that, when woven together, create the architecture of emotional addiction. These are not sequential steps but concurrent threads, each reinforcing the others. The first is rare attention. The seducer gives their target an experience of being deeply, unusually seen, but not constantly. The attention is intense when it appears, and its absence is therefore acutely felt. This is the foundation of the architecture. establishing a standard of connection high enough that ordinary interactions with other people begin to feel pale and insufficient by comparison. The second is manufactured depth. Early in the relationship, the seducer creates an experience of accelerated intimacy, sharing things that feel significant, inviting confidences, establishing the feeling of a private world that exists between the two of them. This manufactured depth creates a powerful bond that the target believes to be organic and spontaneous. The third is calibrated withdrawal. After establishing intimacy and high-quality attention, the seducer introduces distance, not dramatically, not cruelly, but measurably. A message that takes longer to arrive, an afternoon of slightly less warmth, a moment of being occupied with something that does not include the target. This withdrawal activates the wanting system and intensifies the target's focus on the seducer. The fourth is unpredictable return. The warmth returns, but never on a schedule the target can detect. Sometimes after 1 day, sometimes after 5. Sometimes following the target's initiative, sometimes not. The unpredictability ensures that the wanting system remains in a state of activation. The target is always half waiting, half hoping, half alert. The fifth is private language. The seducer creates references, jokes, phrases, and rituals that exist only within the relationship, a shared code that makes the target feel special and creates a sense that what they have together is categorically different from what exists anywhere else in either of their lives. When the architecture imprisons its architect, there is a critical and often overlooked dimension to this dynamic. The seducer who deliberately constructs emotional addiction in another person does not emerge from the process unchanged. The act of being intensely wanted, of watching someone's attention, mood, and sense of well-being become organized around your presence and absence is itself addictive. Howard Hughes, the American industrialist and aviator, spent decades of his life in relationships structured around his enormous power and the absolute control he exercised over those close to him. He constructed environments of total dependency. He also spent the last decades of his life in a darkened hotel room, consuming only bottled water, unable to touch a doorknob without a tissue, tormented by a paranoia and isolation so complete that his extraordinary intelligence and power had nowhere left to go. The architecture of control had consumed its architect. The lesson is not that the tools should not be understood. It is that any system of power you build over another person's emotional life also builds a structure over your own. And the more elaborate the construction, the more you are living inside it. Understand what you are building, and understand that you are also building it around yourself. Chapter 6. The Mirror That Speaks Their Name. In the court of the Sun King, Louis VI of France, who reigned for 72 years, the longest documented reign of any major monarch in European history, there existed a peculiar figure who wielded more consistent influence than most of the generals and ministers who surrounded him. His name was Nicolas de Neuville, Marquis of Villeroy, and his power rested not on military achievement or financial acumen, but on a single extraordinary skill. He made Louis XIV feel, in every conversation, like the most fascinating person alive. Villeroy asked the questions Louis most wanted to be asked. He laughed at precisely the right moments. He remembered, from one conversation to the next, the small details that Louis had mentioned in passing. A concern about a hunting hound, a piece of music he had enjoyed, an opinion about a minor diplomatic matter, and he returned to them at exactly the moment when revisiting them would feel most gratifying. He was not flattering Louis in the crude, obvious way that lesser courtiers did. He was doing something far more sophisticated. He was becoming the best possible audience for the performance that Louis's entire life constituted. Louis XIV kept Villeroy close for over 4 decades. Even after Villeroy suffered a catastrophic military defeat that should have ended his career permanently, Louis protected him, forgave him, and continued to seek his company. He simply could not afford to lose the experience of being that precisely, that perfectly seen, the deepest human hunger. William James, considered the father of American psychology, wrote in the 1890s that the deepest principle in human nature is the craving to be appreciated. Not admired, not praised in the abstract, specifically appreciated, seen, recognized, confirmed in one's particular existence as a person of worth and interest. This hunger is so fundamental and so rarely fully satisfied that when a person encounters someone who seems to fill it genuinely, the effect is immediate and overwhelming. It does not feel like seduction, it feels like recognition, like coming home to a place you never consciously knew you were looking for. The mirror technique exploits this hunger with surgical precision. It is, of all the tools we have discussed, perhaps the most powerful and the most insidious, because it generates in the target an experience that they will interpret not as the seducer's skill, but as the seducer's genuine understanding of who they are. They will say afterward, "I have never felt so understood by anyone." They will believe it completely, and in a strange sense, they will not be wrong, because the seducer has understood them in the technical sense of having accurately modeled their interior world. The question is what that understanding is being used for, how the mirror works. The mirror technique operates through a combination of deep listening, precise reflection, and calibrated amplification. Each element matters. Deep listening, as we discussed in the previous chapter, means attention not to content alone but to emotional subtext, to what the person is revealing about themselves through how they speak as much as what they say. The seducer who practices deep listening is building a detailed model of the target's interior landscape, their values, their wounds, their private image of themselves, and, crucially, their private image of who they wish they were. Precise reflection means returning this material to the target in a form they can recognize as their own, but doing so in the seducer's words, the seducer's framing, the seducer's choice of which elements to foreground. This is not paraphrasing, it is reconstruction. The seducer takes the raw material of what the target has revealed and reshapes it into a portrait that is slightly more vivid, slightly more coherent, slightly more luminous than what the target has been able to construct of themselves. Calibrated amplification is the final and most powerful step. The seducer does not simply reflect who the target is. They reflect who the target is trying to become, the better, braver, more interesting version of themselves that the target carries as a private aspiration. By speaking to this emerging self as though it already exists, by treating the target's aspirations as established facts about their character, the seducer gives the target the extraordinary experience of being seen as they most wish to be seen. Scheherazade in the Art of Becoming Necessary. One of the oldest and most sophisticated examples of the mirror technique in world literature is found in the frame story of 1001 Nights. Scheherazade, facing execution at dawn, survives by telling the king a story each night and stopping at the most suspenseful moment. But her strategy is more sophisticated than simple storytelling. She reads the king, his capacity for wonder, his suppressed guilt, his need for a particular kind of engagement, and she provides exactly what his specific inner world requires. Each night's story is calibrated to what the previous night revealed about the king's responses. She is not simply entertaining him. She is becoming the only person in his world who provides an experience he cannot find anywhere else. The stories are the mirror, a reflection of the king's own interior life, his fears and fantasies and moral questions, given back to him in a form more vivid and satisfying than his own thoughts could construct. He cannot execute her because he cannot bear to lose the experience of being so precisely met. Scheherazade survives for 1001 nights. The king eventually makes her his queen. The mirror, held consistently and skillfully, had transformed a death sentence into a crown. The danger of becoming the mirror. There is a moment in every prolonged use of the mirror technique when something begins to shift in the seducer themselves. The sustained practice of reflecting another person's inner world, of subordinating one's own perspective to the task of becoming whatever the target needs to find, begins to erode the seducer's own sense of distinct selfhood. The philosopher Martin Buber described two fundamental modes of human relationship, what he called I, thou, and I, it. In the I-thou relationship, both people are present as full subjects, meeting each other in genuine encounter, each affecting and being affected by the other. In the I-it relationship, one person treats the other as an object, as a thing to be used, understood, managed, rather than encountered. The mirror technique, by its nature, operates in the I-it mode. The target is not encountered. They are mapped, modeled, and reflected back to themselves with strategic intent. The seducer in this mode is not present as a full subject, they are a surface, and surfaces, however perfectly polished, do not have an interior life. The psychological cost of sustained relating is a progressive hollowing of genuine selfhood, a growing difficulty in knowing what one actually thinks, feels, or wants when the task of reflecting is set aside. Some seducers reach a point where the only experiences they can recognize as real are the moments when someone is responding to them, when the mirror has successfully created the illusion of connection. Without an audience, without someone to reflect, they experience a flatness, a blankness that can become genuinely frightening. Know the mirror as a tool. Keep the self that holds it separate from the surface. The mirror should be something you pick up deliberately, not something your face has become. Chapter 7. Calculated Fractures. Using Vulnerability as Currency. In the autumn of 1959, a young senator from Massachusetts was preparing his campaign for the presidency of the United States. His advisors debated strategy. His opponent would be the sitting vice president, a man of considerable experience and formidable reputation. The conventional wisdom of the era held that presidential candidates should project strength, certainty, and imperturbable confidence. Vulnerability was a liability. Weakness was disqualifying. John F. Kennedy's team arrived at a different conclusion. They would show vulnerability, not the kind that suggested incapacity, but the kind that suggested humanity. In his speeches and interviews, Kennedy spoke with remarkable candor about his fear that a nuclear confrontation with the Soviet Union could destroy human civilization. He spoke about the weight of decisions that had no clearly right answers. He expressed uncertainty in a way that had not been customary in American political rhetoric. The effect was extraordinary. Voters did not perceive these admissions as signs of weakness. They perceived them as signs of depth, of honesty, of a man sufficiently secure in himself to tell the truth about the difficulty of the world. Kennedy won the election by one of the narrowest margins in American presidential history. But won it he did. The carefully chosen fractures in his public confidence had done precisely what his advisors hoped. They had made him feel real. The paradox of strength through weakness, the counterintuitive discovery that vulnerability can be a source of power rather than a liability, is not a modern insight. The ancient Greeks built it into their dramatic tradition. The tragic hero, Oedipus, Achilles, Agamemnon, was always a figure of exceptional power brought low by a specific personal flaw. And it was precisely the flaw, the wound, the human limitation in otherwise towering figure that made the audience invest emotionally in their fate. Aristotle, in his Poetics, described this as hamartia, the fatal flaw that makes the hero relatable. Without the flaw, he argued, the tragic protagonist would be too perfect to generate empathy. We would admire them the way we admire a statue. With the flaw, we recognize them, we see ourselves in them. We care what happens to them. This is the psychological mechanism that calculated vulnerability exploits. When a person who appears strong, competent, or desirable reveals a crack, a moment of genuine pain, a story of past failure, a confession of fear, the observer does not step back, they step forward. The crack is the invitation, the wound is the door. What makes vulnerability magnetic? Brené Brown, a research professor at the University of Houston, spent over a decade studying vulnerability and arrived at findings that initially surprised her. She had expected to find that the most well-adjusted, happily connected people she interviewed were those who had learned to minimize their vulnerability, to protect themselves effectively from emotional exposure. Instead, she found the opposite. The people who reported the deepest sense of connection and belonging were precisely those who were willing to be seen in their imperfection. Brown coined the term wholehearted living to describe this quality and published her findings in several books, most notably Daring Greatly, which became a global phenomenon. Her work is genuinely oriented toward human flourishing and authentic connection, but her findings illuminate something darker as well. The person who offers vulnerability is, in most social contexts, extending an implicit invitation to closeness. They are signaling that the space between the two people is safe enough for truth. The dark seducer understands this signaling function and uses it deliberately. They offer vulnerability, not as an authentic expression of their inner life, but as a strategic communication, one designed to lower the target's defenses, to create an experience of reciprocal intimacy, and to generate in the target a sense of responsibility for the seducer's emotional state. The science of emotional contagion and responsibility. Social psychologists have documented extensively that human beings are not emotionally autonomous in social situations. We catch feelings from the people around us, a process called emotional contagion, and we experience the emotions of those we care about as partially our own. When someone we are close to is in pain, we feel a version of that pain. When someone we are invested in is happy, we feel some of their happiness. This emotional interconnection is, in most contexts, a beautiful feature of human relationship. It is the neurological basis of compassion, but it also creates a specific vulnerability. When someone shares their pain with us, particularly pain that is offered as something they have not shared with many others, we tend to feel responsible for it. We do not want to be the person who heard about the pain and did nothing. We want to be the one who helped. The seducer who reveals a carefully chosen wound to the right person at the right moment triggers this mechanism with precision. The target, having been taken into confidence, now has an investment in the seducer's well-being. Emotionally, they have become responsible. And responsibility, as we know from the previous chapter's discussion of commitment and consistency, creates attachment. Historical examples: sympathy as strategy. Mary, Queen of Scots, who has inspired more romantic mythology than almost any other figure in British history, was a master of deployed vulnerability. Imprisoned by her cousin Elizabeth, for nearly 20 years, Mary maintained an extraordinary level of political relevance and romantic fascination through her letters, which circulated widely and depicted her as a martyr. Wrongly imprisoned, suffering nobly, denied the throne that was rightfully hers. The suffering was real, but Mary was also a sophisticated political operator who understood that her vulnerability, properly communicated, was one of her most potent tools. She maintained correspondence with potential supporters across Europe, painting her captivity in terms that were simultaneously heartbreaking and inspiring. Her letters were not simply cries for help. They were carefully constructed arguments for why she deserved loyalty, sympathy, and action on her behalf. The sympathy she cultivated contributed directly to multiple plots to free her and place her on the English throne. Plots whose discovery eventually convinced Elizabeth to have her executed in 1587. Even then, Mary's reputation for tragic nobility survived her death and grew with it. She had converted her captivity and suffering into a form of lasting power that outlived the woman herself. The calibration, how much to reveal. The art of calculated vulnerability lies precisely in calibration. Too little and no intimacy is created. The person remains behind their armor and generates no sense of accessibility or depth. Too much and the effect reverses. Instead of sympathy and attraction, the target feels overwhelmed, burdened, and instinctively seeks distance from an emotional intensity they did not sign up to manage. The ideal calibration follows a principle that therapists call titration, the gradual addition of small amounts of a substance to achieve a desired reaction. The seducer reveals enough to generate connection and investment, and stops before generating discomfort. They create the impression that more exists, that what has been shared is a privilege, a selection from a larger reserve of depth, while keeping the remainder in reserve for later moments when additional investment is needed. The wound must be real enough to ring true, specific enough to feel genuine rather than performed, and just contained enough that the target feels they have been trusted rather than ambushed. This is a precise art, and like all precise arts, it requires practice, attention, and a quality of honest self-observation that is, paradoxically, at odds with the strategic intent behind the act. Chapter 8. The Haunting. Presence Without Touch. In the summer of 1819, a 23-year-old poet named John Keats met a young woman named Fanny Brawne at a party in Hampstead. He fell in love with her, with a completeness and a misery that he documented obsessively in his letters. letters that have become some of the most analyzed expressions of romantic obsession in the English language. Keats was dying of tuberculosis. He knew it. He spent the last years of his life in a state of exquisite torment, living next door to the woman he loved, separated from her by the wall between their two houses, able to hear her, sometimes to see her, but prevented by his illness and his poverty from the full presence he craved. What is remarkable about the Keats and Braun story from the perspective of this chapter is not the suffering. It is what the suffering produced in Fanny. She was by all contemporary accounts a lively, sociable young woman with no shortage of suitors, yet Keats occupied her completely. After his death in Rome in 1821, she wore mourning for 6 years. She kept his letters. She never fully shook the presence of a man who had been, for most of their relationship, physically absent or inaccessible. He had haunted her, not through overwhelming presence, but through a carefully maintained incomplete proximity. Close enough to be felt, far enough away to be longed for. The physics of yearning. Distance in human relationships does not work the way we might intuitively expect. We tend to assume that presence creates attachment and absence diminishes it. The reality is more complex and more psychologically fascinating. Psychological research consistently shows that moderate distance, enough to create longing, but not enough to create disconnection, intensifies emotional investment rather than weakening it. This is sometimes called the Romeo and Juliet effect. After the 1972 research by Richard Driscoll, Keith Davis, and Milton Lipitz, who found that parental opposition to romantic relationships increased rather than decreased the partner's feelings for each other. Obstacle, it turns out, does not cool passion, it concentrates it. The seducer who understands the physics of yearning learns to calibrate proximity with the precision of a musician calibrating tension on a string, tight enough to produce a clear note, not so tight that the string breaks, never slack enough to produce nothing at all, the language of the unsaid. The most powerful form of presence does not require words. In fact, words can sometimes diminish rather than enhance it. The Japanese aesthetic concept of ma, sometimes translated as negative space or interval, holds that the spaces between sounds and music, between objects in a room, between words in a conversation, are not empty. They are charged with the potential energy of what is not being filled. A great calligrapher's brushstroke is defined as much by where the brush does not touch as where it does. The seducer who understands ma becomes a master of strategic silence, not the silence of having nothing to say, which registers as emptiness, but the silence of someone who has more to say than they are choosing to say. This distinction is everything. When a person is clearly holding something back, the observer's imagination immediately begins to work on the content of the withheld material. The imagination, generating its own version of what is not being expressed, almost always produces something more compelling than the truth could have been. Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor and Stoic philosopher, wrote in his Meditations that the universe is transformation, life is opinion. What we experience in another person is largely what we project onto them. What our own need and imagination construct from the raw material of their signals. The seducer who provides incomplete signals gives the target's imagination permission to do the most beautiful work of seduction on their behalf. Gesture and glance, the grammar of non-verbal power. Albert Mehrabian's research in the 1960s at UCLA, though often oversimplified in popular psychology, pointed towards something genuinely important. In communications about feelings and attitudes, nonverbal signals carry disproportionate weight. The way a message is delivered, the tone, the posture, the expression, the timing, communicates more about emotional meaning than the content of the words themselves. The dark seducer learns to speak fluently in nonverbal grammar. They understand that a glance held precisely 1 beat longer than social convention requires creates a moment of electricity that a direct verbal compliment cannot match. They understand that leaning slightly towards someone during a conversation and then, at a crucial moment, leaning very slightly away creates a physical enactment of the advance and retreat dynamic, making the target lean forward in response without consciously understanding why. They understand the power of touch used sparingly, a brief contact, the hand on the arm that lasts half a second longer than casual contact warrants, the shoulder brush that could have been accidental but clearly was not, when used rarely, creates a disproportionate effect. The nervous system of the person being touched registers the contact, files it, returns to it. The rarity of the touch is precisely what gives it weight. What is plentiful is taken for granted. What is rationed becomes precious. The ghost who lived in Napoleon's exile. When Napoleon Bonaparte was exiled to the island of St. Helena following his final defeat at Waterloo in 1815, he was physically isolated from the world that had been shaped by his will. Yet he remained, for the remaining 6 years of his life, one of the most present forces in European politics, not through action, but through the power of his lingering influence in the minds of his enemies, his former subjects, and his admirers. He dictated memoirs and letters that circulated through Europe. He maintained correspondence. He commented on events he could not affect. He was a ghost, present everywhere in imagination, nowhere in body. And his ghostly presence arguably shaped European political thought more powerfully than many rulers who held actual power during those same years. Victor Hugo, Beethoven, Stendhal, Byron, all remained preoccupied by Napoleon long after his exile. He haunted the 19th century from a rock in the South Atlantic. This is the extreme historical version of what the skilled seducer accomplishes on a smaller scale, the creation of a presence so vivid and so precisely calibrated that it persists and amplifies in the imagination of those who have been exposed to it, independent of further contact. Becoming unforgettable, the residue you leave. The haunting does not begin when you leave. It begins with the quality of your attention when you are present. The person who creates a haunting pays attention in a way that makes the target feel that they are, in this moment, the most interesting thing in the world. Not flattered, genuinely attended to. Then they leave. Slightly before the moment of full satisfaction, slightly before the conversation is fully resolved, and they leave without announcing their departure as a significant act. The target is left holding an experience that was vivid and then cut short. They have the full force of the attention and the slight dissatisfaction of incompletion. They will think about the conversation later. They will replay it. They will find themselves wondering what the seducer was thinking at certain moments, what they meant by certain pauses. The mind that has been precisely activated and then left without full resolution will continue its work without anyone requesting it to. You have left a ghost of yourself inside someone else's mind. It will speak in your voice. It will carry your quality of attention. You have left a ghost of yourself inside someone else's mind. It will speak in your voice. It will carry your quality of attention. It will be more faithful to the best version of the impression you made than any further interaction could guarantee. This is presence without touch. This is the haunting at its most refined. Chapter 9. The Poison Chalice. Pleasure that enslaves. In the late 1970s, a casino manager in Atlantic City made a discovery that would transform the gambling industry and, by extension, reveal something fundamental about human psychology. He noticed that certain slot machines produced dramatically more revenue than others. Not because the payout rates were different in any meaningful way, but because of the pattern of their payouts. The machines that paid out frequently but in small amounts did well. The machines that paid out rarely but in large amounts did well. But the machines that paid out unpredictably, sometimes small, sometimes nothing, occasionally large, never according to any pattern the player could identify, produced a level of compulsive play that the other configurations could not approach. He had rediscovered, in a commercial context, exactly what B.F. Skinner had found in his laboratory with rats. The variable ratio schedule of reinforcement, unpredictable reward, produces the most persistent, most compulsive behavior of any reward pattern. The gambling industry built an empire on this principle, and the dark seducer, whether knowingly or not, uses the same mechanism to create emotional bonds that resist rational analysis and deliberate dissolution, the chemistry of craving. Addiction researchers have long recognized that what distinguishes addictive substances and behaviors from non-addictive ones is not simply the pleasure they provide, but the specific way they interact with the brain's reward prediction circuitry. Cocaine, for instance, does not simply produce pleasure. It produces a spike in dopamine far exceeding any naturally occurring reward, followed by a crash that makes normal pleasures seem pale and insufficient. The addict is not chasing pleasure. They are chasing the memory of pleasure, which ordinary life can no longer replicate. Stanton Peele, a psychologist who spent decades studying love and addiction, argued in his 1975 book Love and Addiction that romantic obsession and substance addiction share the same psychological structure. Both involve the elevation of a single source above all other sources of pleasure and meaning. Both produce escalating tolerance, the need for more to produce the same effect. Both result in withdrawal when the source is removed, and both generate the same quality of craving, an urgent, consuming preoccupation that displaces other interests and concerns. Peele was not simply making a metaphor. He was describing a genuine overlap in neurological mechanism. The person who is addicted to another human being is experiencing something chemically similar to substance dependency, and the behavior patterns that result are correspondingly difficult to modify through rational intention alone. The Ottoman Empire and the politics of ration favor. The imperial court of the Ottoman Empire developed over centuries, one of the most sophisticated systems of rationed favor in human history. The Sultan's access was controlled by elaborate protocols. Audiences were granted infrequently and after extensive waiting. Gifts to the Sultan had to pass through multiple intermediaries. His approval, when given, was expressed in forms that required expert interpretation, and was never given so freely that it could be taken for granted. The effect of this system on the courtiers, who operated within it, was precisely what intermittent reinforcement produces in laboratory subjects: obsessive focus on the source of the valued but unpredictable reward. Ottoman historians document case after case of extraordinarily capable administrators and generals whose lives were consumed by the project of obtaining and maintaining the Sultan's favor. Men who might, in a different context, have directed their formidable intelligence toward other ends. The court was an addiction machine, and the Sultan's approval was the drug. The Grand Viziers who served the Ottoman court understood this mechanism, and used it deliberately to maintain the Sultan's own dependence on their counsel, creating situations in which the Sultan felt uncertainty and providing themselves as the solution to that uncertainty. The system of ration favor operated in multiple directions simultaneously, creating webs of mutual dependency that were extraordinarily difficult to disentangle. Delivering the poison with a warm hand. The poison chalice works only if it is administered with warmth and apparent sincerity. This is the essential and the most insidious element of the strategy. The intermittent reinforcement that creates addiction must feel, to the target, like genuine affection that is sometimes impeded by circumstances rather than deliberately withheld. If the distance feels deliberate, the target may feel manipulated. If it feels organic, the result of the seducer's complexity, their busy life, their own emotional struggles, it produces the intended effect. This is why the most effective operators in this mode are not cold people playing calculated games. They are warm, genuinely charming people who have learned, sometimes without fully consciously intending to distribute their warmth inconsistently. Their inconsistency may even have emotional validity. They may genuinely feel more distant on some days than others, may genuinely be preoccupied at times, may genuinely be working through their own ambivalences. The mixture of authentic feeling and strategic behavior is what makes the pattern both so effective and so difficult for the target to identify as manipulation. The anatomy of withdrawal. Those who have experienced the end of a highly addictive relationship report withdrawal symptoms that closely mirror those documented in substance addiction research: preoccupation with the lost person that intrudes upon other activities. Physical symptoms including sleep disruption, appetite changes, and what feels like physical pain in the chest. Compulsive revisiting of memories, messages, and photographs. Severe reduction in the ability to find pleasure in activities that were previously enjoyable. The Roman poet Ovid, writing in his Amores around 16 BCE, described with remarkable clinical precision the experience of trying to separate from an addictive love. The resolutions broken before the ink is dry, the arguments with oneself that cannot quite close the case, the way the mind returns to its obsession the moment the will relaxes its grip. Ovid was describing what we would now recognize as the behavioral and cognitive signatures of withdrawal from an intermittently reinforced attachment. 2,000 years before Skinner's rats, he had named the mechanism the seducer's own trap. There is a particular irony in the poison chalice that deserves explicit examination. The seducer who learns to deliver pleasure in strategic doses, who becomes skilled at the management of another person's emotional hunger, will often find themselves on the receiving end of a subtler version of the same dynamic, because the target who is in withdrawal will not passively accept their deprivation. They will seek resolution. They will pursue contact, initiate connection, offer attention and affection in escalating amounts. The seducer, who has perhaps been emotionally unavailable for most of their life, finds themselves suddenly the recipient of intense, focused, persistent devotion. And this devotion, precisely because it is so unconditional and so unguarded, produces in the seducer something they have rarely experienced: the sensation of being genuinely wanted, not for their performance but simply for their existence. This is the seducer's own addiction, and having created it, they are in danger of becoming dependent on it. The relationship has become a closed system of mutual dependency, one person addicted to the intermittent warmth of the seducer increasingly dependent on the unconditional devotion of the person they are managing. Both are drinking from the same poison chalice. Both will experience withdrawal when it is taken away. Chapter 10. The residue of you, becoming inescapable. There are people who pass through our lives and leave nothing behind. We remember their names, perhaps their faces, the general fact of their existence. But when we try to recall what it felt like to be in their presence, we find only blankness. The encounter left no residue. And then there are people who leave traces that persist for years, sometimes for decades, sometimes forever. We hear a particular piece of music and think of them involuntarily. We walk past a certain kind of restaurant and feel an echo of an emotion we cannot quite name. We read a sentence that uses a word they used to use and feel, momentarily, as if they are standing just outside our field of vision. They have become woven into the fabric of our experience, not through the volume of their presence, but through the precision of the impression they made. This is not accident, it is art. And it is the art we examine in this chapter, the neuroscience of memory and association. Even Pavlov's famous experiments in the early 20th century demonstrated that the brain does not store memories in isolation. It stores them in networks of association, connected to the sensory context in which they were formed, to the emotional state the person was in when they occurred, to other memories that shared elements of the same experience. Ring a bell every time you feed a dog, and eventually the bell alone produces salivation, because the nervous system has bound the two experiences together into a single associative cluster. Human memory operates on the same principle, with far greater complexity and emotional depth. The experiences we have with a particular person, especially if those experiences were emotionally intense, become linked in memory to the sensory elements of the environment. The smell of a particular perfume, the quality of afternoon light in a specific season, a genre of music, a taste, a physical sensation. These sensory elements, encountered later in entirely different contexts, have the power to activate the associated emotional memory without the person even being consciously aware of the connection. The seducer who understands this creates experiences that are rich in distinctive sensory detail, not accidentally but deliberately. They cultivate an identifiable aesthetic, a specific scent, a characteristic way of dressing, a particular kind of restaurant or environment they prefer, a musical sensibility that the target will encounter repeatedly in their ordinary life. Each encounter with these sensory elements, after the relationship has ended or during periods of distance, silently reactivates the association and the emotion, private languages and shared codes. Perhaps the most powerful form of residue is linguistic. Human beings are meaning-making creatures, and the meanings we construct together with a particular person. The private jokes, the references that require shared experience to decode, the phrases that carry more emotional weight than their literal content, form a kind of private language that persists in the mind long after the relationship has changed or ended. The anthropologist Edward Sapir and his student Benjamin Lee Horff proposed in the early 20th century. That language does not simply describe our experience, it shapes it. The words and categories we have available to us influence what we are able to perceive and think. If this is true in the broad cultural sense, it is even more precisely true in the intimate sense. The private language of a relationship creates a way of seeing the world that is accessible only to those who speak it, and which persists in the mind of each speaker as an ongoing connection to the person with whom it was created. The seducer deliberately builds this private language. They introduce phrases and references that will become part of the target's inner vocabulary. They ask questions that no one else has ever asked. They name something about the target, a quality, a habit, a way of seeing that the target recognizes as true but has never heard articulated. The naming is a gift that cannot be returned. Once someone has been seen in a particular way, and that seeing has been put into words, the words live inside them, in the voice of the person who spoke them. Napoleon's letter and the art of lasting impression. Napoleon Bonaparte, who appears elsewhere in this book as a student of timing and strategic absence, was also a prolific and remarkably effective letter writer. His letters to Josephine, written from military campaigns across Europe and Egypt, were not simply expressions of affection. They were precision instruments designed to remain vivid in her mind during his long absences. They contained specific references to their private life together that no one else could fully decode. They used her private nickname. They described with specificity how he imagined her in particular moments, sleeping, reading, moving through the rooms of their house. These letters ensured that Napoleon lived in Josephine's imagination with unusual vividness during his absences. She did not simply miss a husband. She was haunted by a presence that had learned to inhabit her inner world, to be present in imagination more fully and more specifically than most people manage to be even in person. The letters were not simply communication. They were acts of imprinting. The technique of the unfinished conversation. One of the most practically effective techniques for creating lasting residue is the deliberate practice of leaving conversations unfinished. Not frustratingly so. Not in a way that feels rude or incomplete, but in a way that generates a genuine open loop in the target's mind. A question raised but not fully answered. A topic introduced with evident depth and then set aside before its full significance has been explored. An impression managed so that the most interesting inference about the seducer's inner life is suggested rather than stated. The Zygarnik effect, documented by Russian psychologist Bluma Zygarnik in the 1920s, demonstrated that people remember interrupted or uncompleted tasks far better than completed ones. Waiters, she noticed, could recall the details of unpaid bills with precision, but forgot settled accounts almost immediately. The open loop holds attention in a way that closure does not. The seducer, who ends every interaction with a small open loop. A question implied but not asked. A story begun but not completed. A feeling established but not named. Ensures that their presence in the target's mind continues to work after the physical interaction has ended. The target carries the open loop home with them. They find themselves thinking about it at odd moments. They formulate answers to questions that were not quite asked. They are, without knowing it, extending the conversation in their own mind, and the seducer is present in that extension. The ethics of inescapability. To become inescapable in someone's inner world is to exercise a form of influence over their consciousness that they did not explicitly consent to. This is worth sitting with honestly, even in a book that is fundamentally an exploration of how influence works, rather than a prescription against it. The philosopher Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative holds that we should act only according to principles that we would be willing to have applied universally, that we should treat persons always as ends in themselves, and never merely as means. The art of making oneself inescapable in another person's mind is, by this standard, a use of that person's consciousness as a means to an end, one's own gratification, one's own sense of power, one's own need to matter. There is a version of this that is not exploitative, the version where the impression you leave is genuinely positive, where the residue you place in someone's life actually enriches it. The person who thinks of you when they hear a certain kind of music and feels something like warmth rather than something like hunger or pain. That is a residue worth leaving. The work of this chapter is equally useful for that purpose. The choice of what you leave behind and how you leave it belongs, as always, to the kind of person you have decided to be. Chapter 11. The Choreography of Control. Leading the Dance Invisibly. In 1963, a young social psychologist named Stanley Milgram published the results of what would become the most discussed and most disturbing experiment in the history of behavioral science. He had placed ordinary people in a room with a scientist in a white coat and instructed them to administer what they believed to be increasingly severe electric shocks to a person in the next room whenever that person gave a wrong answer on a test. The person in the next room was an actor. The shocks were not real, but the subjects of the experiment did not know that. What Milgram found was that approximately 65% of ordinary non-violent people continued to administer shocks up to the maximum level marked danger, severe shock, even when the actor in the next room was screaming, then silent, then apparently unconscious. They did so not because they wanted to cause harm, but because the scientist in the white coat continued to calmly instruct them. Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. Milgram's experiment is most often discussed as a study of obedience to authority, a sobering illustration of how easily ordinary people can be led to do extraordinary harm when the social architecture around them normalizes it. But it is also something else, a demonstration of how profoundly the behavior of one person can be shaped by the framing provided by another, especially when that framing is delivered with calm, confident consistency and an apparent claim to expertise. This is the foundation of invisible control. Authority is not exercised through force. It is constructed through context, the architecture of invisible authority. Robert Cialdini, whose work we encountered earlier in this book, identified authority as one of 6 core principles of influence, alongside reciprocity, commitment, social proof, liking, and scarcity. His research demonstrated that people are far more likely to comply with requests made by someone who appears to be an authority. Not someone who announces their authority, but someone who carries the signals of authority naturally and consistently. The signals of authority are partly explicit credentials, titles, associated expertise, and partly non-verbal and atmospheric. A person who speaks at a measured pace, not slowly enough to seem uncertain, but not quickly enough to seem anxious, registers as confident. A person who uses pauses before answering significant questions registers as thoughtful. A person who does not immediately explain or justify their positions, who allows silence to do some of the work, registers as secure enough in their knowledge not to need approval. These signals do not require content to work. They work primarily through the emotional impression they create. This person is at ease in a way that suggests they know things I do not, that their perspective comes from a foundation I have not yet accessed. This impression, once established, makes the target more receptive to the seducer's framing, more inclined to defer to their judgment, more likely to follow their lead without requiring explicit persuasion. Catherine the Great and the Art of Governing Through Relationship. Catherine II of Russia, who ruled the Russian Empire for 34 years in the 18th century and presided over one of its greatest periods of territorial and cultural expansion, was a masterful practitioner of invisible leadership. She was not born Russian. She was a German princess who had come to Russia as a teenager to marry the heir to the throne. She had no natural claim to the loyalty of the Russian court, the military, or the Orthodox Church. She had to create it. What distinguished Catherine's approach was her understanding that real power is built not through commands, but through relationships. She cultivated an extensive network of personal connections with the figures whose cooperation she needed, not through bribery alone, though she used material rewards skillfully, but through making each person feel that their relationship with her was personal, valued, and distinctive. She wrote letters in her own hand to advisors and generals. She remembered details of their personal lives and asked about them. She created, around herself, an atmosphere in which being in her good graces felt not like political calculation but like genuine belonging. The effect was that her court did not experience itself as being controlled. It experienced itself as being led by someone whose vision was compelling and whose care was genuine. Her commands felt like shared decisions. Her influence felt like inspiration. The choreography was invisible because the dancer did not feel themselves to be moving at anyone else's direction. Strategic ambiguity, the power of the unfinished instruction. One of the most underappreciated tools in the invisible leader's arsenal is strategic ambiguity, the deliberate practice of not fully specifying one's expectations or intentions, leaving the other person to fill in the gap according to their own interpretation. This technique was documented in organizational contexts by James March and Herbert Simon, whose 1958 book Organizations described how effective leaders often issue directives that are vague enough to allow subordinates to interpret them favorably, creating a sense of ownership over the outcome without reducing the leader's ultimate control over the direction. But the principle operates in personal relationships with equal effectiveness. When a seducer expresses interest in a way that is genuine but not definitive, when they create an atmosphere of possibility without explicit commitment, the target fills in the ambiguity with their own hope. They become the author of their own optimism. And because the positive interpretation comes from within them rather than being asserted by the seducer, it is far more resistant to external skepticism. They will defend it against their own doubts and their friends' caution, because they feel it as their own perception, rather than as something they have been told. Narrative control. Becoming the protagonist of the story they tell themselves, every human being constructs a narrative about their own life, a story that explains who they are, where they came from, what they are trying to do, and what the events of their life mean. This narrative is not simply a record of events. It is an active, ongoing interpretation that shapes how new experiences are perceived and integrated. The seducer who can insert themselves into this narrative as a significant, positively valenced figure has achieved something remarkable. They have become part of the story the target tells about themselves. And because our self-narrative is something we defend and maintain with considerable psychological investment, the figure who has become part of it is difficult to remove without doing damage to the narrative itself. This is the deepest form of invisible control. It is not the management of a person's behavior in a specific situation. It is the gentle restructuring of the story through which they interpret all situations, including the story of you and them. Once you have become a protagonist in their narrative, the person who saw them clearly, the person who helped them become more fully themselves, the person who represents a particular kind of possibility, removing you from that story requires a rewriting that feels like loss. The dancer who forgot they were following. Argentine tango, one of the most sophisticated partner dance forms in the world, operates on an invisible communication system between the leader and the follower that is entirely nonverbal and felt through the body. The best tango teachers describe the ideal lead as something the follower should not be able to identify as a lead. They should simply find themselves moving as if the movement were their own idea, as if their body had decided to go in this direction independently. This is the ideal of invisible choreography in every context. The target should feel free, should feel in fact more free than they feel in other relationships, because you are not explicitly constraining or demanding anything. They should feel that the direction of the relationship is emerging organically from who they both are. The choreography should be felt only as the pleasure of moving in harmony with someone whose rhythm they have come to know. When this is achieved, control has become something else entirely. It has become culture, the invisible air of a relationship, breathed in so naturally that neither party notices it as a construction. This is the apex of what we have been studying. And it is, as every apex is, both the culmination and the beginning of a new set of questions about what power of this kind is actually for. Chapter 12. Splinters of the Soul, the Ethics of Exploiting Pain. This is the chapter this book has been building toward and the one that is most difficult to write honestly. Everything we have discussed until now has operated in a gray area. Techniques that can be used with genuine care or with strategic intent, principles that serve authentic connection as readily as manipulation. This chapter is different. What we examine here is the deliberate exploitation of another person's emotional damage, the use of their wounds not to understand them, but to control them. It is the darkest material in this book, and it is the most important to understand. Understanding it is the only reliable defense against it. Not the vague awareness that manipulation exists, but the specific, technically precise knowledge of how it works, what it looks like from the inside, what signals it produces, what it does to a person over time. If this knowledge is to serve any good purpose, it must be held with absolute clarity about what it costs. The wound as a lock. Every significant emotional wound creates what psychologists call a schema, a cognitive and emotional template through which subsequent experiences are interpreted. A person who is abandoned in childhood does not simply carry a memory of abandonment. They carry a lens through which new relationships are continuously scrutinized for evidence of impending abandonment. A person who is shamed for their needs does not simply remember being shamed. They have learned at a deep level that need itself is dangerous and shameful. These schemas operate largely below the level of conscious awareness. The person who carries an abandonment schema may not be aware that they are interpreting their partner's need for an occasional evening alone as evidence of rejection. They simply feel the rejection with all the urgency and pain of the original wound, without fully understanding why the current situation has triggered such an intense response. The lock is there, but they cannot see it. They experience only its consequences. Jeffrey Young, a psychologist who developed schema therapy in the 1990s, building on Aaron Beck's earlier work in cognitive therapy, identified 18 core maladaptive schemas that underlie a wide range of psychological difficulties. What Young observed in clinical practice was that these schemas tend to generate predictable behavior patterns in relationships, specific ways of responding to perceived threats that are deeply habitual, difficult to interrupt, and that often confirm the very fears they arise from. How the exploiter finds the lock. The person who intends to exploit emotional damage does not begin with the damage. They begin with what appears to be compassion. They respond to hesitation and partial disclosure with patience rather than pressure. They create an atmosphere of remarkable safety, the sense that here finally is someone who will not judge. In this atmosphere, the target's defenses relax naturally. They share things they rarely share. They describe experiences and fears and wounds that they have perhaps never articulated fully even to themselves. And as they share, the exploiter is mapping, noting which wounds produce the strongest emotional response, which fears carry the most charge, which needs are most acutely unmet. Having mapped the landscape, the exploiter positions themselves precisely at the point of greatest need. If the target's deepest wound is abandonment, the exploiter becomes the person who will never leave, who is available, who is responsive, who makes declarations of permanence. If the wound is inadequacy, they become the unwavering believer in the target's worth. If the wound is invisibility, they become the person who seems to see everything. Historical cases. When exploitation destroys. Charles Manson is perhaps the most extreme historical example of the deliberate exploitation of emotional damage at scale. Manson, who created the murderous cult community that came to be known as the Manson family in California in the late 1960s, had no legitimate claim to authority, no extraordinary physical presence, and no conventional resources. What he had was an extraordinary ability to identify the specific psychological wounds of the young people he encountered, primarily young women who had been rejected by their families, who felt invisible in conventional society, who desperately needed to belong somewhere, and to position himself as the answer to every wound. He offered unconditional acceptance, a sense of unique understanding, a community of belonging, and a narrative of special significance that made each recruit feel that their damaged, outcast life had been a preparation for something important, rather than a series of failures. The exploitation of their wounds was so complete, so precisely calibrated that many of his followers participated in murder and still maintained loyalty to him for decades afterward. Manson's case is extreme, but it illustrates the mechanism at its logical endpoint. Emotional exploitation, pursued without moral restraint, can dissolve a person's capacity for independent judgment so thoroughly that they lose access to their own ethical sense. The wound that was exploited becomes the wound through which all subsequent experience is funneled, and the exploiter controls the filter. The costs to both parties. The target of emotional exploitation pays an obvious price. The systematic deepening of their wounds rather than any genuine healing, the erosion of their capacity to trust their own perceptions, and the extraction of loyalty and service under false pretenses. The damage done to a person who has been exploited in this way can take years of therapeutic work to address, and some never fully recover the capacity for trust that was taken from them. But the exploiter also pays a price that is less often discussed. The sustained practice of approaching other human beings as collections of exploitable vulnerabilities rather than as full persons progressively damages the exploiter's capacity for genuine connection. They become skilled at the surface of intimacy without ever experiencing its substance. They accumulate relationships characterized by dependency and compliance, rather than by the kind of mutual recognition that makes human connection genuinely nourishing. Many of the most skilled emotional exploiters describe, in unguarded moments, a peculiar loneliness, a sense of going through the motions of closeness without ever feeling it, the armor they have built against being manipulated themselves, because the skilled exploiter is almost always someone who has been significantly exploited in their own past, also keeps out the experience they are ostensibly pursuing. They have made themselves unreachable, and unreachable is another word for alone, the line between understanding and weaponizing. We return, as we must in this chapter, to the question of how this knowledge can serve any good purpose. The answer is that understanding how emotional exploitation works, technically, precisely, without euphemism, makes it recognizable. A person who has read this chapter carefully will find it more difficult to be slowly isolated from their support network by someone who claims to be the only one who truly understands them. They will recognize the pattern of needing them to be uniquely wounded and uniquely saved. They will feel the structure of what is being built around them. This is not a comfortable kind of knowledge. It cannot be held with the innocence that preceded it. But innocence in this domain is not a protection, it is an invitation. The dark chapters of human relating do not stop occurring because we decline to look at them. They occur more effectively when no one is looking. Chapter 13. The Invisible Throne. Subtle Dominance in Practice. When Elizabeth I of England ascended to the throne in 1558, she faced conditions that should have made her reign impossible. She was a woman in an era when female sovereignty was considered an aberration of the natural order. She was the daughter of Anne Boleyn, whom her father Henry VIII had executed on charges of adultery and treason, charges that most historians now believe were fabricated. She had no husband, no male heir, and a court full of men who believed that the solution to all of England's problems was for her to marry quickly and hand governance to a man. Elizabeth did not marry. She also did not argue in any sustained way for the legitimacy of her authority. She did not deliver speeches about women's rights or challenge the prevailing ideology directly. Instead, she constructed an elaborate symbolic world in which her power was so thoroughly naturalized, so thoroughly woven into the fabric of English identity and culture, that challenging it felt less like a political act and more like a kind of sacrilege. She cultivated a mythology around herself, the Virgin Queen Gloriana, the mother of the English nation, that was so potent and so deeply embedded in national consciousness that her courtiers found themselves defending her authority with a fervor that had nothing to do with abstract principle and everything to do with the emotional investment they had in the story she had become. She had not claimed the throne through argument. She had made the throne inseparable from herself. This is subtle dominance at its most magnificent, power that is not declared but inhabited. The difference between force and authority. The sociologist Max Weber, writing in the early 20th century, made a distinction that remains foundational to our understanding of power. He identified three types of legitimate authority: traditional authority, which derives from custom and heredity; rational legal authority, which derives from rules and procedures; and charismatic authority, which derives from the personal qualities of the leader, from the follower's belief in that person's exceptional gifts or mission. Weber's insight was that the most durable power is not power that relies on force, which requires constant expenditure of energy to maintain and generates resentment that eventually overcomes compliance, but power that is experienced by those subject to it as legitimate. When people believe in the right of someone to lead them, compliance becomes voluntary. And voluntary compliance is not only more efficient than coerced compliance, it is more complete, because it does not require surveillance to sustain. The subtle dominator works in Weber's third category, the realm of charismatic authority. They construct their authority not through explicit assertion, but through the accumulation of small moments that collectively communicate. This person is different. This person understands things that others do not. This person's judgment can be trusted. The physical grammar of dominance. Research in social psychology has documented extensively that dominance is communicated and perceived through non-verbal signals, many of which operate below the threshold of conscious awareness. Amy Cuddy's research at Harvard Business School, later popularized in one of the most watched TED Talks in history, demonstrated that the physical posture a person adopts affects not only how others perceive them, but how they perceive themselves. Expansive, open postures increase feelings of confidence and power, while contracted postures decrease them. Beyond posture, dominance is communicated through the management of space and time. The person who arrives slightly late to a gathering, who does not rush to fill silences, who moves through a room at their own pace rather than adjusting their movement to the energy of the space, who allows their eye contact to carry slightly more steadiness than social convention requires. This person is communicating dominance without a word about power being exchanged. The subtle dominator has internalized this grammar so thoroughly that they no longer think about it. They occupy space the way a tree occupies space, not by demanding room, but simply by being too rooted to be moved. This rootedness is felt by everyone in the environment, even those who could not articulate why one person in the room feels more substantial than another. The Confucian ideal and the power of the implicit. Confucius, the Chinese philosopher whose thought has shaped East Asian culture for 25 centuries, developed an elaborate theory of social harmony built on the concept of lie, often translated as ritual propriety or correct behavior. Confucius observed that a society in which the forms of proper behavior are deeply internalized requires very little explicit governance. When everyone knows their role and performs it with genuine care, harmony emerges as a natural consequence. The ruler in the Confucian ideal leads not by commanding but by embodying, by being in their own person, such a perfect example of moral rectitude and social grace that the court and the populace naturally orient themselves around them the way compass needles orient to magnetic north. The Analects record Confucius saying that the good ruler is like the North Star. It dwells in its place, and all the stars rotate around it. This is a poetic description of what we are calling subtle dominance. The center of gravity does not assert its centrality, it simply is central, and everything else arranges itself accordingly. Practical techniques of invisible leadership. The person who wishes to develop subtle dominance in their interpersonal relationships can focus on a specific set of practices, each of which contributes to the overall effect of settled authority without overt assertion. The first is the deliberate management of reactivity. The subtle dominator does not respond quickly to provocation, criticism, or attempts to destabilize them. They allow themselves to receive information, including uncomfortable information, without immediately producing an emotional output. This non-reactivity is registered by those around them as strength. It suggests a person who is not threatened by the world, who can afford to take time, who does not need the situation to resolve on their terms immediately. The second is the consistent expression of perspective without aggression. The subtle dominator states their views clearly and does not immediately soften or qualify them in response to social pressure. They are willing to disagree. They are willing to be unpopular in a specific moment. This willingness, particularly when it is expressed without hostility or contempt, communicates confidence in their own judgment that others find difficult not to respect. The third is the cultivation of genuine expertise or depth in at least one domain. Charismatic authority, as Weber noted, must have some basis in real perceived quality, in something the followers actually believe the leader has that they do not. Shallow displays of dominance without genuine substance behind them eventually collapse. The person who has genuine depth in some area, whether it is knowledge, experience, artistic sensitivity, or emotional intelligence, has a foundation for their authority that is not entirely performance. When the throne becomes a prison, Elizabeth I died in 1603, having never married, having no heir, having kept her court and her country in a state of permanent anticipation about the succession for 45 years. The Virgin Queen mythology that had sustained her power had also constrained her life in ways that are only partially visible in the historical record. She could not fully trust anyone, because everyone who sought her company also sought something else: land, title, power, access. The throne she inhabited was also, in its way, a solitary confinement. The subtle dominator who constructs authority around their person eventually faces the same paradox. The more successfully they have created an environment that revolves around them, the more they are surrounded by people whose relationship to them is mediated by the power differential. The experience of being simply and ordinarily human, of needing without strategy, of being uncertain without performance, of being seen without armor, becomes increasingly unavailable. Power is not the absence of need. It is more often than not the inability to admit need without losing what the power was meant to secure. This is the invisible throne's most honest accounting. It is real, it is effective, and it is, in ways that only become clear at a certain altitude, entirely lonely. Chapter 14. The Art of Vanishing, Disappearance as Amplification. On a warm evening in June of 1816, a gathering of literary figures sheltered from a violent thunderstorm in the Villa Diodati on the shores of Lake Geneva. Among them were Lord Byron, Percy Bysshe Shelley, his companion Mary Godwin, and Byron's personal physician John Polidori. Bored by the rain and inspired by a collection of German ghost stories, Byron suggested a competition. Each person would write their own ghost story. Mary Godwin, who would soon become Mary Shelley, wrote what became Frankenstein, one of the founding texts of science fiction. Polidori wrote The Vampire, which established the romantic vampire archetype that would eventually become Dracula and all that followed. But Byron himself, the most famous poet in England, wrote almost nothing that night. He offered fragments, suggestions, the beginning of a story, and then left it unfinished. This was characteristic of Byron's relationship to his own legend. He was one of the first modern celebrities, mad, bad, and dangerous to know, as Lady Caroline Lamb famously wrote of him, and he cultivated his fame with extraordinary sophistication. Central to his technique was strategic disappearance. He would appear at a gathering, overwhelm the room with his presence, create an encounter that everyone in attendance would remember for the rest of their lives, and then he would leave England entirely for Greece, for Switzerland, for Italy. The absence that followed his presence amplified the impression he had made. People who might have adjusted to his proximity and begun to see him clearly could not do so because he was gone. The economics of scarcity. The principle that scarcity increases perceived value is among the most reliably demonstrated findings in behavioral economics. Wirchel Lee and Odwell's 1975 experiment demonstrated it with cookie jars. People rated the same cookies as more desirable when they were presented in a jar with only 2 cookies versus a jar containing 10, even though the cookies were identical. The scarcity was not a signal of quality. It was perceived as a signal of quality. Robert Cialdini, whose work on influence we have encountered throughout this book, identifies scarcity as one of the fundamental principles of persuasion, precisely because it taps into a deeply embedded evolutionary heuristic. Things that are rare tend to be more valuable than things that are abundant. The brain uses availability as a proxy for worth, because in most ancestral environments, this was a reasonable approximation. The seducer who understands the economics of scarcity manages their availability with the precision of a commodity trader managing supply. They do not become scarce randomly. That would simply create confusion and distance. They become scarce strategically, at the peak of emotional investment, when the target has the most to lose from the withdrawal of attention. The neuroscience of missing someone. When a person we are emotionally attached to is absent, the brain does something remarkable. It does not simply register the absence as a neutral fact. It activates the social pain network, the same neural circuitry that responds to physical pain, and begins a process of memory consolidation that tends to preserve the positive elements of the absent person's presence while filtering out the negative ones. Researcher Roy Baumeister has documented what he calls the bad is stronger than good principle, the general tendency for negative experiences to have a stronger impact than equivalent positive one. But in the specific context of absence and longing, this principle appears to be partially reversed. The absent person is idealized. The small irritations, the moments of disconnection, the realistic limitations of the person and the relationship, all of these tend to recede in memory during periods of longing. What comes forward, sharp and vivid, is the best of what was. The seducer who vanishes at the right moment allows this process to work on their behalf. They withdraw before the target has had sufficient experience of them to form a fully realistic picture. What the target carries forward into the absence is not a complete, nuanced portrait, but a highlighted version. The moments of greatest intensity, the experiences of deepest connection, the impression of possibility that has not yet been fully tested. Thoreau at Walden and the strategic withdrawal. Henry David Thoreau's retreat to Walden Pond in 1845 was, on its surface, an experiment in simplicity and self-sufficiency. He built a cabin, grew his own food, and spent 2 years and 2 months in deliberate withdrawal from the social and commercial life of Concord, Massachusetts. The experiment produced Walden, one of the foundational texts of American literature. What is less often discussed is the social dynamic that Thoreau's withdrawal created. He did not disappear entirely. He walked into Concord regularly, had dinner with the Emerson family frequently, received visitors at his cabin, but his withdrawal was real enough, and his project sufficiently described and anticipated that it transformed his absence into a statement. He became more interesting for his withdrawal, not less. His ideas, circulating in his absence, gathered weight from the fact of his deliberate distance from the world. When Walden was published in 1854, 9 years after his retreat, it found an audience that had been waiting, unconsciously, for the kind of clarity that distance produces. Thoreau had vanished from ordinary social life and returned with something to say that could only have been produced by the vanishing. A strategic disappearance must meet several specific conditions to amplify, rather than extinguish attachment. The first is timing. The withdrawal must occur at a moment of high emotional investment, when the target has something to miss. A disappearance that occurs before genuine connection is formed produces not longing but indifference. The second is quality of exit. The moment before the disappearance must be particularly memorable. An interaction of unusual depth or intimacy, a moment of apparent vulnerability or unusual closeness, a statement or gesture that carries significance. These create the emotional baseline against which the absence is felt. The greater the contrast between the peak experience and the subsequent silence, the more acute the longing. The third is maintenance of distant signal. The disappearance should not be complete silence in most contexts. A very occasional signal, a brief message, an unexpected reference, something that says I exist, and you are in my peripheral awareness without saying I am here and available, keeps the attachment from fading into confusion and eventual grief. It maintains the open loop that the Zeigarnik effect identified as central to ongoing preoccupation. The fourth is the quality of the return. When the seducer reappears after strategic absence, the return must feel like an event, must carry the weight of something significant happening, rather than simply a resumption of ordinary contact. The return should be slightly unexpected in its timing, generous in its attention, and should reference the period of absence in a way that acknowledges the target's experience without apologizing for the distance. The disappearance that never ends. There is a cautionary dimension to the art of vanishing that every practitioner eventually confronts. Repeated strategic disappearances, even when individually effective, can create a cumulative effect in the target's psychology that eventually produces something other than longing. They produce anticipatory grief, a state in which the target has learned to expect loss and has begun unconsciously to protect themselves against it by preemptively withdrawing their investment. The target who has been made to miss someone too many times eventually stops allowing themselves to fully believe in the return. They enjoy the returns more cautiously. They hold something back. They have learned at a bodily level that presence is temporary and that full investment will eventually be punished by another absent. The scarcity strategy, pursued too aggressively or too long, trains the target out of the very quality, open, trusting investment that makes them worth pursuing in the first place. Chapter 15. The Final Knot, When Influence Becomes Possession. In 1973, a bank robbery in Stockholm, Sweden produced an outcome that baffled police, journalists, and psychologists. After being held hostage for 6 days, several of the bank's employees emerged from the vault with apparent sympathy for their captors. One of the hostages later refused to testify against the robbers. Another visited one of them in prison. A third reportedly became engaged to one of her captors for a period after his release. The term coined by criminologist and psychiatrist Nils Beguerow to describe this phenomenon, Stockholm Syndrome, has since passed into common usage as a shorthand for the paradoxical bonding that can occur between hostage and captor. The psychological mechanisms underlying Stockholm Syndrome have been studied extensively in the decades since the Stockholm incident. What researchers have found is that the dynamic is not mysterious or rare. It is in fact the predictable result of specific conditions, total dependency of the captive on the captor for basic needs, the periodic experience of small kindnesses or relief from threat from the captor, isolation from other perspectives, and prolonged intensive contact without the ability to leave. These conditions do not need to be as extreme as a bank robbery to produce their effects. They can be created and are created by the millions in ordinary intimate relationships through subtler and longer-term processes, which is precisely what this final chapter examines. The architecture of psychological possession. Psychological possession, as distinct from physical possession, which is illegal, and legal possession, which applies to property, refers to a condition in which a person's psychological autonomy has been so significantly compromised by another person's influence that their thoughts, feelings, desires, and self-perception are substantially organized around that other person's needs, preferences, and assessment of reality. The possessed person is not imprisoned in any physical sense. They can leave the room, end the phone call, walk out of the relationship, but they do not, or they return immediately when they try, because they have lost, or never fully developed, a psychological center of gravity that operates independently of the possessor. Their inner voice has been progressively replaced, or at least heavily colonized, by the possessor's voice. They measure themselves by the possessor's standards, feel validated or worthless according to the possessor's approval or disapproval, and interpret reality through a lens that the possessor has, over time, carefully installed. How does this state come to exist? Not through a single dramatic act, but through an accumulation of small, individually unremarkable processes, many of which we have examined throughout this book. The final chapter of any sustained campaign of influence is simply the point at which all of these processes have compounded to the degree that they have become structural. Gaslighting and the erosion of epistemic confidence. The term gaslighting derives from the 1944 film Gaslight, in which a husband systematically manipulates his wife into doubting her own perceptions, most memorably by dimming the gaslights in their home and then insisting when she notices that she is imagining it. The film depicted something that therapists and abuse researchers had observed in clinical practice for decades: the deliberate, sustained undermining of a person's confidence in their own perceptions. Gaslighting does not require dramatic incidents. It operates most effectively through cumulative small moments: the slight frown that greets a perfectly reasonable observation, followed by a gentle suggestion that the observer is being overly sensitive; the confident assertion of facts that slightly contradict the target's memory of events; the concerned inquiry about the target's mental state when the target expresses a perspective that inconveniences the possessor. The repeated experience of being gently but persistently corrected on matters of perception creates over time a state of epistemic uncertainty, a condition in which the target no longer fully trusts their own reading of reality and begins to defer to the possessor's version as more reliable than their own. This epistemic dependency is the foundation of possession. A person who cannot fully trust their own perceptions cannot use those perceptions to navigate away from the relationship. They are, in a very practical sense, lost inside someone else's version of reality. Intermittent reinforcement, the final stage. We have discussed intermittent reinforcement extensively in this book, from Skinner's rats through the architecture of emotional addiction. In the final stage of psychological possession, the reinforcement schedule has become the entire structure of the relationship. The target is now so deeply conditioned by the alternating warmth and coldness of the possessor that the pattern itself has become the source of meaning. Research psychologist Donald Dutton, whose work on domestic violence and psychological abuse is among the most rigorous in the field, identified what he called the abusive cycle, a predictable sequence of tension building, incident reconciliation, and calm that characterizes many possessive relationships. What Dutton found was that the reconciliation phase, which often involved unusual warmth, remorse, and affection from the possessor, was precisely what made the cycle so difficult to exit. The warmth of the reconciliation, experienced against the background of the preceding pain, was neurologically equivalent to an extremely high-value reward delivered on an intermittent schedule. It created an attachment that was, paradoxically, more intense than the attachment formed in relationships without conflict. The target of this cycle does not want to leave because they are stupid or masochistic or lacking self-respect. They do not want to leave because the neurochemistry of the relationship has been structured through the intermittent reinforcement of the cycle to make leaving feel like cutting off a part of themselves. Historical example: Abelard and Heloise revisited. We met Heloise and Abelard in the first chapter of this book, the 12th century lovers whose relationship was destroyed by her uncle's violent intervention. We noted the intensity of Heloise's continued devotion to Abelard in the letters she wrote across the decades of their forced separation. But looking at their story again, from the perspective of this final chapter, something else becomes visible. Abelard's letters back to Heloise are strikingly different in quality from hers to him, where Heloise writes with raw, unguarded longing, speaking frankly about her continued desire, her difficulty accepting the separation, her sense that she has never stopped being his. Abelard writes with theological detachment. He counsels her toward God, toward the spiritual life, toward acceptance of their condition as the working out of divine will. He addresses her less as a lover than as a spiritual director addressing a troubled parishioner. What this asymmetry reveals is that the psychological possession in their relationship ran primarily in one direction. Heloise was organized around Abelard in a way that he was not organized around her. His voice lived inside her. Hers, it appears, did not equally inhabit him. She had become possessed. He had become, in the most literal sense, unavailable, behind a religious vocation that provided a socially sanctioned distance from the intensity of what she continued to feel. The final question. This book has been an honest account of the mechanisms by which one person gains and maintains psychological influence over another. We have examined these mechanisms from the historical record, from behavioral science, from social psychology, from the literary and cultural traditions that have preserved the human species' long fascination with power and desire. The final question, the one this epilogue will begin to address, though it cannot fully answer it, is the one that every person who has read this book carefully now has to sit with. Having understood these mechanisms as precisely as we now do, what are we going to do with that understanding? There is a version of this knowledge that hardens a person, that makes them more guarded, more strategic, more suspicious of warmth they did not provoke. This version is not without value. Awareness of these mechanisms is genuine protection against them. But it is protection at a cost. The cost of inhabiting a world in which every overture of connection is evaluated for its strategic dimension before it is felt. There is another version. The version that uses this knowledge not as a weapon or exclusively as armor, but as a map of human vulnerability, including one's own, that generates something like compassion. The recognition that the person who is using these techniques on you is almost certainly someone who has had them used on them. That the chain of possessors and possessed extends backward through human history to the first moment one person understood that another person's need could be a lever. That understanding the mechanism does not require you to become part of it. The strongest chains, as we have said, are the ones we wrap around ourselves, but so are the strongest freedoms. The choice of which to construct is, in the end, the only choice that matters, and it is the one that no technique, no mechanism, and no chapter in any book can make for you. Epilogue. The cost of the crown. What the shadow takes from you. Every chapter in this book is a blade, and a blade that is never sheathed will eventually cut the hand that holds it. The most dangerous outcome of mastering dark magnetism is not what you do to others. It is what you slowly do to yourself. This epilogue is the reckoning, the psychological price of living behind a mask, the loneliness of the puppeteer, and the one question no chapter dared to ask until now: what do you actually want? The seducer who has read this far has absorbed a body of knowledge about human psychology that is genuinely powerful. They understand the mechanics of desire, the architecture of attachment, the grammar of nonverbal communication, the neuroscience of addiction, and the historical record of how the most influential figures in human history have constructed and maintained their hold on the imaginations of others. What they may not have yet fully reckoned with is the cumulative cost of living in a permanent strategic relationship with the world. To always be constructing, to always be reading, to always be managing the distance and the approach, to always be wearing a face that has been selected rather than simply lived. This is exhausting in ways that are difficult to articulate, because the exhaustion is not of the kind that sleep addresses. It is an exhaustion of the self. The shadow is real. Walk into it with your eyes open, and remember as you do that the greatest act of power available to any human being is not the power over others. It is the power to choose with full awareness of the alternatives who you are going to be.